On a frozen January morning in 1945, American girl named Sarah Elizabeth Morgan stood alone on a road in eastern Germany with nothing but a worn photograph of her grandparents' farm in Pennsylvania and a desperate determination to reach it, and behind her lay 5 years of war and loss, and ahead of her lay 500 miles of enemy territory and burned cities and refugee columns, and she had no map and no money and no one to help her, but she began walking anyway because home was the only thing she had left to believe in. Sarah had been born in Philadelphia in 1932, a father who worked as an international correspondent, and a mother who had been a concert pianist before marriage, and in 1938 her father had been assigned to cover the growing tensions in Europe, and the family had moved to Berlin, where they rented an apartment in a comfortable neighborhood, and Sarah had attended the American school and learned German and made friends. And she had been happy in the way that only children can be happy when they do not understand the darkness gathering around them. The war caught them by surprise, even though it should not have, because her father had been writing stories about the coming conflict for years, but somehow he had believed until the very end that diplomacy would prevail, and when Germany invaded Poland in September 19, the Morgan family found themselves trapped in a nation that was suddenly at war with their allies. And the American embassy worked frantically to evacuate citizens, but the chaos was overwhelming, and the Morgans missed their chance. But what happened next changed everything, because the family decided to wait out what everyone believed would be a short war, and her father continued his work now, filing stories through neutral Switzerland, and for 2 years they lived in a strange limbo. Americans in an enemy capital watching the world burn from the inside, and then came Pearl Harbor, and suddenly they were not just foreigners but enemies, and her father was arrested, and her mother was placed under house arrest, and Sarah was sent to live with a German family who had been paid to watch her. The years that followed were a blur of fear and confusion and loss, because Sarah never saw her father again and learned only after the war that he had died in a prison camp in 1943, and her mother died of pneumonia in 1944, still under house arrest and unable to see a proper doctor, and Sarah was left entirely alone at 13 years old in a country that was crumbling around her and that had taken everything she loved. And then something no one expected happened, because the German family that had been watching Sarah fled Berlin in January 1945 as the Soviet army approached, and they left her behind because she was not their responsibility and she was American, and they did not want to explain her presence to the Russians, and Sarah found herself alone in a bombed-out city with no one to turn to and no place to go. What she discovered next would shake her understanding of what she was capable of, because Sarah realized that she had a choice. She could wait in Berlin for whatever came next, or she could try to reach the American lines that she knew were somewhere to the west, and she could try to find her way home to the grandparents in Pennsylvania, who did not even know she was alive, and she chose to walk. Behind these ruins, a secret waited, because Sarah had been preparing for this moment without knowing it for months, gathering small items that might be useful, learning the geography of Germany from maps she found in the ruble, and practicing her German until it was flawless, and she had sewn American money into the lining of her coat, money that her mother had hidden, and that might buy her passage when nothing else could. She left Berlin on January 25th, 1945, walking west through the outskirts of the city while Soviet artillery thundered in the distance, and she joined the great river of refugees that was flowing away from the Eastern Front. Millions of people fleeing the approaching army, and she became one of them, just another homeless child in a nation of homeless children. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because walking west through Germany in January 1945 meant walking through hell, because the roads were clogged with refugees and the skies were filled with Allied aircraft that sometimes strafed anything that moved, and the nights were so cold that people froze to death in their sleep, and there was no food and no shelter, and Sarah saw things that no child should ever see. She learned to survive by attaching herself to groups of refugees who did not ask too many questions, and by helping care for younger children and elderly people who needed assistance, and by making herself useful so that people would share their food and their warmth. And she never told anyone she was American, because she knew that could mean death, and she spoke only German and pretended to be an orphan from Berlin. The landscape she walked through was apocalyptic, because the Allied bombing had destroyed city after city, and the roads were lined with the wreckage of the German war machine, burned tanks and abandoned artillery, and the bodies of soldiers who had died defending a lost cause. And Sarah walked past all of it without stopping, because stopping meant dying, and she had not survived this long to die now. She crossed into territory controlled by American forces in late March 1945 near the city of Frankfurt, and she approached an American checkpoint and spoke English for the first time in months, and the soldiers did not believe her at first because she looked like any other German refugee, thin and dirty and hollow-eyed, but she showed them the photograph of her grandparents' farm, and she told them her story, and something in her voice convinced them. The intelligence officers who debriefed her were amazed that a 14-year-old girl had walked 500 miles through the dying Reich and survived, and they asked her countless questions about what she had seen and heard, and she told them everything she knew, and her information about conditions inside Germany proved valuable even though she had not intended to gather intelligence and had only been trying to survive. She was evacuated to Paris, and then to London, and finally to New York, where her grandparents were waiting at the dock because the army had notified them that their granddaughter was alive, and when Sarah walked down the gangplank and saw them, she ran into their arms, and she wept for the first time since leaving Berlin because she was finally safe and she was finally home. The adjustment was harder than anyone expected because Sarah had been a child when she left America, and she returned as something else entirely, someone who had seen death and walked through fire and who understood things about human nature that no child should understand. And she had nightmares for years, and she found it difficult to connect with other teenagers who worried about things that seemed trivial compared to survival. She finished high school and went to college and became a journalist like her father, because she believed that telling the truth about the world was the most important thing a person could do, and she covered conflicts around the world, always returning to the theme of civilians caught in war and children who suffered for the decisions of adults. She wrote a memoir in 1965 called Walking Home that became a bestseller and that is still taught in schools today, and the book describes her journey in unflinching detail, the hunger and the cold and the fear and the small acts of kindness that kept her alive. And it became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the particular suffering of children in wartime. The memoir brought her back into contact with some of the people who had helped her along the way, and she traveled to Germany several times to thank them and to hear their stories, and she learned that many of them had not survived the war, and she mourned them, even though she had barely known them, because they had given her pieces of themselves, and those pieces had kept her alive. She married a fellow journalist named Robert Whitfield in 1958, and they had 3 children, and she raised them on the farm in Pennsylvania. Had been her destination during those desperate months in 1945, and she taught them about resilience and compassion and the importance of helping others even when helping was dangerous. Sarah Elizabeth Morgan Whitfield died in 2018 at the age of 80, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including refugees and immigrants she had helped throughout her career, and historians who had studied her wartime journey, and her obituary was carried by newspapers around the world because her story had touched so many lives. Her memoir remains in print today, and new generations continue to discover her story and to be inspired by the courage of a girl who walked alone through a war to find home, and educators use her book to teach children about the Second World War and about the strength that exists within every human being. The photograph that guided her across Germany is now displayed at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans alongside her worn shoes and the coat with the money sewn into the lining, and visitors stand before these humble objects and try to imagine what it must have been like to be 14 and alone, and to choose to walk 500 miles toward an uncertain hope. She was asked once in an interview what had kept her going during those terrible months, and she said she had thought about her grandparents every day, and she had imagined arriving at their farm and seeing their faces, and she had told herself that every step brought her closer to that moment, and she said that hope was like food for the soul, and that as long as you had hope you could survive almost anything. That is the legacy of Sarah Elizabeth Morgan, the American girl who walked alone through a war to find home, who proved that even in the darkest times a determined spirit can find its way to safety, and whose story reminds us that the children of war carry burdens that we can barely imagine, and that some of them find within themselves a strength that can move the world.